I'm Dr. Sarah Todd. I'm an emergency medicine doctor at Falmouth. I'm the co-director now. I'm going to share my story with you today. And really, I feel like my story is a love story. Here we go. So, that's Evan. Some of you in the room knew him. This is us when I met him in college. I met him before classes started my freshman year. I came to Colgate University. I was a freshly minted EMT. I had taken the EMT class the summer between high school and college, and I was ready. I showed up. I went to the basement of the hospital in Hamilton, New York, to the cafeteria, and had a meeting with the ambulance. And that's where I met Evan for the first time. We kind of grew up in medicine together. He was a junior when I showed up, and he was a medic, which is a strange designation in EMS that about 2 states have. He was essentially a paramedic without the training on children. He was also a college student, but we did this for fun. Some people play varsity sports in college. It takes up all their time. We played ambulance. We loved it. It was It consumed most of our time. We didn't go out and drink most nights because there could be an ambulance call and we wouldn't want to miss it. Friday night was the one night we went out and had fun. It became our family. It was a way that connected us to the town where our school was. That was just such a wonderful experience for me. I grew up in the suburbs of Chicago, and I went to this tiny little town in upstate New York, and I got to meet so many people in the community through being on the ambulance. It was wonderful. I want to tell you just a little bit about Evan. He loved to cook. He loved to eat. He probably loved to eat more than he loved to cook, but I think they oftentimes go hand in hand. He loved to drink coffee. It was one of his favorite things. He was a smart aleck. He was witty and sassy and very sarcastic. He was just a wonderful, wonderful guy. We went through our college career, chased each other around. He left for medical school my senior year, and then I followed him to where he was, started a PhD program, hated it, cried every day, said, something in my life is not right. I left the PhD program and went and got my master's in public health at the University of Michigan. One of the really fun things, Evan and I were very different. I liked to go at a very fast pace, and we would go for what we called chases in college. I'd say, you want to go for a run? He said, yeah, let's go for that chase. We'd run, I'd run in front of him, and he'd follow after me. I like to pack a lot of things in. So there was this period in our lives, about 6 weeks. I graduated with my master's in public health. We got married. We went on a honeymoon. We came home. He graduated from medical school, and then we moved to upstate New York for his residency. We stayed there for 3 years. Well, actually, we stayed there for 6 years. But his residency was 3 years. While we were there, I went to medical school. I had our first baby, and I finished medical school. I was lucky enough to take a year off when we had our first child. It was a great experience. After Evan's residency in Albany and my medical school, we went to Indiana for my residency. Then, for the first time in our lives, we could pick where we wanted to be. We could pick where we wanted to live. I voted for the mountains. Evan voted for the ocean. How do you think I did? Just some other pictures here of the ambulance, Evan and I. Wow, you look different. This is him. He grew up outside of Cleveland, and this is him at the Woodmere Fire Station where he would work in the summers when he was home. One of the other things about Evan, he loved to give advice. He was a sought-after counsel with all of our friends in college and in the many places we went. My eldest refers to this as, he's about to drop some knowledge, which is a quote from Hamilton, the musical, if you've seen it or listened to it. But this is at our wedding. He's going to tell my dad something, obviously. My dad really needs to know. This is Evan and his sister, again at our wedding. Just really fun times. When we moved here, we came in July of 2008. I have to check my dates. Yep. We came and I was pregnant. It was my first job. Evan had worked different jobs, both in New York and in Indiana, so it wasn't such a new thing for him. We came, we worked, we shared a job actually. We shared about a job and a half. And I had our baby the last day of 2008, and we just kind of settled in to having 4 people in our family instead of 3 people, that kind of early career, getting to know our community, what we wanted to do. We were having a lot of fun. I went to work on January 12th, 2010. And I was working in the emergency department. I heard the EMS radio go off, and it went to my house. I listened to enough of the ambulance call to think it wasn't one of my kids, to know that it was Evan. I said, okay, we can do this. I called my partner, who I think was doing some work in the basement, and I said, I need you to come. I have to leave. The ambulance has gone to my house. I need to get home. So he came up, and I signed out my patients to him. And I got in my car, and I drove home. We didn't have a nanny. We didn't have significant babysitters then. We just worked different shifts so that one of us was always with the kids. So I get home, and I get home to this scene of Evan's being loaded into the ambulance. I see him. I see that he's upright. I see that he's talking, which is really encouraging to me. When I was in residency, he had had a heart attack. So I assumed, of course, we're dealing with another cardiac issue. And he was upright and circulating. So I thought, okay, we can handle this. So we didn't really speak. We kind of waved at each other as he was being loaded into the ambulance. And I went inside to our then 7-year-old, who was in the kitchen doing homework with her dad when he felt down and started shaking. All the things we taught that child. We never taught her how to push send on the cordless phone. So she dialed 911 and then waited because she didn't know that you had to hit the send button. Her piano teacher had come to the house for her piano lesson, and she'd even struggled to let her in. Our front door has a really tough lock, and they eventually got her in, and the piano teacher called the ambulance. Got the kids situated, so oldest is 7. The second one at this stage is 1. Got someone there to watch him, and got in my car and drove to the hospital. I didn't even get out of my neighborhood before my partner, the same one that I'd signed my patients out to, called me and told me that Evan had a brain tumor. Wasn't expecting that. I don't think you're ever prepared. So there's a lot that happens in that immediate time of diagnosis and initial treatment. I got to the hospital. This is where I work. This is where I'd left probably 20 minutes before, and I was the doctor, and now here I am, the family member. The neurologist was already there. He had seen Evan. He was reading the CAT scan and showed it to me and walked me through the CAT scan so I could see. I looked at it, and I knew that this tumor was going to kill him, and long before he ever should have died. We went from Falmouth up to Brigham and Women's. He had an admission for a few days, and because he was on medicine to thin his blood for his heart condition, he couldn't have surgery right away. So we came home. We went back up. He had surgery. He had a period of recovery, and then he had radiation. With his surgery, they were only able to get about 20% of the tumor. all of the fibers for the right side of his motor system, his leg and his arm, went through the tumor, and they just couldn't tease him apart. I knew my husband very well. He was never an athlete. He had asthma when he was a child, but moving was still really important to him. And when the neurosurgeon came out and told me and his family, his parents, and my friend who was there with me, that they were only able to get 20% of the tumor, I knew it was the right choice for him because he would still be able to function. The radiation that he went through, that first bit, he decided to do it up in Boston. And that was 6 weeks of 5 days a week radiation. Now, anybody who's had any experience with this, you drive up to Boston from the Cape, keep your fingers crossed that the machine's working when you get there. Some days it's not. Some days it's, we think it'll be ready in 20 minutes. Do you want to hang out? Some days you feel like it, and some days you don't. One of the things that has stuck out to me with this story of what my life has become and been is the incredible amount of love and support that came to Evan and I and our family from the community. And I just want to, Evan was the EMS medical director for Falmouth Hospital and a bunch of the surrounding communities. So specifically the Falmouth Fire Department showed us just incredible amounts of love throughout this whole journey, to the point where for 5 weeks, they drove Evan 4 days a week up to his treatment, not the ambulance. People that were off duty, that worked for the fire department that knew him, drove him. And that helped me be able to continue working. It helped my kids be able to, the one who was in school, be able to go to school and just have some semblance of normal life at home. And I have forever been thankful to all of them that did that for us. Other people did things. People brought us food. In fact, there are even people in this room that would bring us food and meals. People gave our kids rides, different places. I had a friend who showed up at my house who brought about a month's supply of paper plates, plastic silverware, and napkins, and she said, "You should not have to do dishes at this time. Here you go." She said, "I could cook for you, but that wouldn't be very good. Don't do dishes." I said, "Thank you." Wasn't exactly what I expected. Because Evan and I were both physicians, because we had grown up in medicine together, we had seen a lot of death. We had seen people die on the icy winter highways in upstate New York traumatically when it wasn't expected. We had transported people to the hospital in their last days when they were dying from cancer. We had taken care of patients in the emergency department who were in their last days. We'd seen so much. We'd talk about it. We'd talk about it because it upset us as caregivers, that it upset us when we had to take care of patients when we felt the patient didn't really want what was happening, but the family wasn't ready to say goodbye. We'd been doing that for years. Of course, my personality, I wanted to know everything. I wanted everything out there. So when Evan was diagnosed, we had to have a conversation. I needed to go over with him what he wanted. Was it still what we talked about? You got to tell me right now. Come on. As you can imagine, he wasn't really interested in that. The timing wasn't right for him. We had a short conversation before he had his initial surgery, and things were as I had suspected. He wasn't interested in a tremendous amount of care that he didn't think was going to help. I thought we would be so far ahead of the curve because we knew all this stuff. It didn't make the conversation any easier. Not at all. That conversation with him was hard. The conversation with the 7-year-old, who is a very old soul, was really hard too. So I'm managing him from a wife perspective, knowing way too much from my medical background. I'm managing my own emotions and feelings and thoughts. And here I've got my little 7-year-old who asks me all these questions. Mom, is this going to kill Dad? You know, when I had gone back to work, I had actually spoken with one of the pediatricians. I called her for a consult on a patient, and she said, Sarah, how are you doing? What's going on? And she was actually my kid's pediatrician as well. She said, I grew up in a household where my mom was always supposed to die and my dad died really young. Be honest. Whatever you do, do not lie. Just be honest with the kids. You don't have to tell them everything. Answer the little questions that they ask, but be honest with them. And that's just kind of my personality anyways. So I was honest, and she would say, is Dad going to die? And I'd say, yeah, sometime, but we don't know when. I'd say, he's going to get sick. We're going to know that he's getting worse before he dies. It's not, unless he gets hit by a bus, right? It's not going to be he's going around doing everything he's supposed to do and then we're going to lose him one day. We'll know. That wasn't really very satisfying for a 7-year-old. And we talked about it really every day because she initiated the conversation. Soon after this initial diagnosis treatment, settling into real life with this new level of chaos, she started asking me questions about sex. I said, I know everything you're going to need to know about this topic for the next 40 years. This is so much easier to talk about than Dad dying. Bring it on, babe. So take this conversation that frequently is a hard conversation between parents and kids, and frame it with this other stuff going on. I'm like, yes, this was awesome. And I felt pretty confident if I hadn't seen it in my own life, I'd seen it at work, and I could figure it out on the internet if not. But that conversation was really easier in the scope of what was going on. As I mentioned before, the differences in our personality, I wanted to know absolutely everything. We would go, even after his initial everything, he had monitoring about every 4 months. We would go up north initially to Dana-Farber, and then we'd go to South Shore and have his MRIs followed by an appointment with a neuro-oncologist, and it would kind of be a race. We'd have his MRI, and then we'd go up to the clinic and see if we could get there before his images loaded, so the neuro-oncologist couldn't read them while we were there. But we made it fun. They were our dates. We typically didn't have any kids with us. The kids had people watching after them then, and we would go to lunch, we would go shopping. We had a really good time. Even before we got to that state, even before he had his surgery, I knew enough of him, and he had talked to me, and he said, I don't want to know my prognosis. I don't want to know my time frame. I don't want to know these details. And I'm like, I do. So we came up with a system where we'd have these appointments, we'd have a nice talk, he'd have his examination, and then I'd turn to him and I'd say, do you want anything else? And he'd say, no. And I'd say, okay, you leave now. So he would leave, and the neuro-oncologist and I would talk. And you know, my questions at the beginning, is he going to be who he was before? Is he going to be able to be a doctor? Is he going to be able to work? Is he going to be able to walk? I wanted to know. I also wanted to know time frame, which he never told me. His answers were always not satisfying to me. I wanted the date, and he never gave it to me. But this was one of those things that being his caregiver really evolved for me because I couldn't make the choices for him. I couldn't decide what therapies he would have. I couldn't decide what he should do. I had opinions. Believe me, I had opinions. But when he asked me about them, that's all they were, is my opinions. This interplay and this, what goes on in a marriage, what goes on in a relationship when it's not a marriage and you're trying to care for somebody else, struck home for me in a way that it hadn't before. I'd seen it, but it was really profound for me. It even went as far as his mother would say things to me like, "You're going to let him eat that?" And I'm like, "I'm not his mom. I'm his wife. I'm here to have a good time with him and love him and support him. I'm not telling him what to eat. That's not my job." What he looked like at this stage after he had the surgery and the radiation, there was no chemo initially. It was just the surgery and the radiation. What he looked like, he looked normal. There was an initial period of recovery, maybe about 2 months, where he really struggled with his walking and his right leg, but that quickly resolved. And unless you were trained or had lived with somebody with a neurological problem, most people would miss it. He had seizures. He continued to have seizures, and his seizures would look like this. His leg would twitch. So he could stand, and he could make it look like he was just, moving, or he would sit down, and unless you were looking at him and you knew, you would miss the whole thing. He continued to work. He came out of clinical practice pretty soon after his diagnosis. But he did quality in the emergency department, patient safety, and he worked with EMS. He loved riding on fire trucks and ambulances. Any opportunity he could have, he took it. Working for him was something that I think really kept him alive a lot longer than if he hadn't worked. He felt like he was contributing to our family. He was bringing in an income. He was really making a huge impact with the stuff he was doing in the emergency department, and it was really important to all of us that worked there. And he'd never had, working in the emergency department, it is a little bit different than an office job, as I'm sure many of you who have spent any time there could see, or those of you that have worked there. And he got to be in an office with the same people showing up all the time, which was really neat for him. I really feel like that prolonged his life. I know if he had come home and spent all his time with just his family, no matter how much he loved us, he would have checked out a lot sooner. So this period, he really had the 2 years after his diagnosis, he struggled. Physically, he was good by about 8 weeks, but he was scared. He didn't trust his body. It had betrayed him for a second time. And he was trying to figure out how to live with this new terminal diagnosis. We'd just had our second kid. He was 38 years old. And that took about 2 years for him to get over. But he eventually made it. We had 3 really fun years that were more normal, a new normal, but more normal. One of the things I mentioned, he was never an athlete before, but I liked to be active and I wanted the kids to do things. And we went out bike riding, and because of where his tumor was, he couldn't get off the bike. He could get on the bike, he could ride the bike, but he couldn't get off the bike. So we did this for a little while. We'd go out for a bike ride, and he would go home in front of all of us and fall over in the front yard on the grass, okay? Because he literally couldn't, and it never occurred to us to let me go home and maybe hold the bike while he got off of it. And I'm not sure why that didn't occur to us. Probably because I had a kid on my bike and I was managing 2 others. But he would have these big bruises, the big bruise from where he landed on his leg getting off the bike. But he was game. He was doing it. He wanted to, and that was wonderful. He, the whole time, we're just kind of waiting for the other shoe to drop. We have those appointments every 4 months. Every time something happens, he falls down. We had a big 100-pound dog to make everything easier, right? If he falls down because the dog knocks into him, or a kid runs into him, or he gets a word wrong, or he can't remember a name, we're like, is this your tumor? I wonder. We'd seen changes, but we'd always seen changes. Nothing was huge. Nothing was really out of the ordinary. And we went in the late spring, early summer of 2015 and had that fateful appointment where we were told that they could see change on the MRI. This was his malignant transformation. This was the beginning of the downhill spiral. The slide that Dr. Guadagnoli had before where you're cancer and you go, phew, we were at that top of that peak going down. This brought up a lot of things. There were a lot of options. There were a lot of possibilities. Did he want to have surgery again to see if maybe now suddenly they could get the tumor? Did he want to have a biopsy? After his first experience with neurosurgery, he said, never again. I'm not interested. I don't want to go through that. It was really the recovery for him that was the hardest. He said, what are you going to learn? You couldn't get the tumor the first time. Are you going to get more of it now, or are we doing it so we can have a knowledge of what it is as we try and fight it? And the answer was pretty much the second one. The neurosurgeon reviewed his films, but there was no, oh yeah, I think I can get it all out now. Surprising that didn't change in 5 years. Radiation. He opted for radiation. It was a 5-day course done at Falmouth Hospital with Dr. Canaday. Not too bothersome for him, not too significant. He was offered a whole range of chemotherapeutic agents. His question with every chemo that he was offered, what's it going to be like for me? How am I going to be able to be a dad if I'm on that medicine? What's it going to be like? He opted for one chemotherapy that was an injection about every 4 weeks, and the side effect was he was tired. I have to tell you, as his wife, by this point I left out, we had another child. So by this point we have 3 kids. And him being tired for a day and a half was really inconvenient. It really was. But we managed. We still did it. With this spurred on more of our conversations, and everything that he did was for quality of life. It wasn't for quantity. It wasn't because his mom wanted him to do it or because I said, oh, I read a National Geographic article. It was because he chose it. And that was a wonderful thing to share with him. Again, growing up in medicine together, having the experiences together, we had very similar views. I knew he was going to die from this tumor when I saw it the first day he was diagnosed. That wasn't a surprise. And all we could control was what he chose to do in that journey. With this malignant transformation, I said, that's it, we're going on vacation. Come on. At that point, our kids we had a 7th grader, a 1st grader, and a preschooler. And we went on vacation for 10 days, just pulled everybody out of school and said, here we go. We were lucky enough to be able to bring a whole other grown adult with us on vacation so we could have some alone time with each kid. And that was wonderful. Within 2 months of coming home from that vacation, Evan had trouble walking. And it was so wonderful that we went when we did, because we got to have that last trip where things were normal. The other thing that happened at this time was hospice. We came home from vacation, and I said, okay, Evan, it's time to go into hospice. And he said, what? I don't want to go into hospice. And I said, okay, but the rest of us need it. You should do this now. He was able to start a hospice, interesting listening to Mr. Dreyfus's talk, where he could continue his chemotherapy. Nobody thought the chemotherapy was going to cure him, but it really did a lot to reduce the swelling in his brain, which really decreased his symptoms. So that was wonderful. At the beginning, he probably saw the hospice nurse once every 2 weeks, and he felt like it was really inconvenient. He did not want to have to be home when he made the appointment, because what if in 2 weeks he didn't want to be there? We got around that problem. He was taken out of driving at this time too. He didn't think he needed to be, but between the neuro-oncologist and I, we said, no, you can't be driving anymore. That driving, that loss of independence was one of those things that he didn't know how he would deal with. And as we talked about what was important to him, he never said, I don't think I can survive if I can't drive. But he was a really independent person, and this whole cancer had knocked him down to needing a lot of help from others, and that was super hard for him. So he started out, he said, driving, okay. He did okay. One of the things that from the very beginning was that walking. He wasn't sure, if he couldn't walk, he wasn't sure that he wanted to go on living. And that may sound ridiculous. There are plenty of people that survive just fine not walking, but that was one of his big lines in the sand. He drew it in the sand. He got closer, and finally he crossed over to the other side and he was still okay. What he thought he could handle changed over his 7-year journey with his brain tumor, which is part of why I thought it was so important that we always kept revisiting the conversation. He didn't want to, but when hospice got involved, it really spurred on lots of questions that I didn't even know to ask. The questions about a DNR, CPR, a feeding tube, dialysis, those were no-brainers. We both knew he wasn't interested in any of that. I thought he wanted to die at home. We talked about it, and he said, yeah, I want to die at home. I said, awesome. What hospice did when they came in was they said, Sarah, you need to ask your kids if it's okay if Dad dies at home. Oh, yeah, there are 3 other people in this equation. I can handle it, I think. So I asked each one of our kids, you okay if Dad dies at home? And at this stage, we talked about it as a family. They all knew he wanted to die at home. And they said, yeah, that was okay. Then came the questions as he worsened. Do you want to be home when Dad dies? Yeah. Do you want to be at school? Do you want to be somewhere else? I can find you someone who will take you out and you can go have ice cream. They all wanted to be at home. Those were questions, parts of the conversation that I didn't even know to ask. Without hospice, I wouldn't have known. The rides, I talked about the fire department giving him rides at the beginning. I'm going to bring in the rides that he got from people who would drive an hour to pick him up, drive him back an hour towards where they came from to take him to a meeting that was an hour. Maybe it was an hour and a half. And then they drive him home an hour, and then they drive themselves home another hour. So that's 4 hours of driving for maybe 1.5, occasionally 2 hours of a meeting. That was amazing. That connection to his community, that being able to be involved, being able to feel loved and respected and like his opinion still mattered, kept him alive. It was just incredible, just absolutely incredible. I want to switch from my situation and what I've been talking about, put that on the side burner, and tell you a story of mine from my residency. I was an intern, so a first-year resident. I was doing a critical care rotation, and I got called. I can't remember if it was late at night or early in the morning, but it was not the normal business hours of the hospital, to do an admission for a woman. I went in, she was in her mid-60s, and she'd had a massive heart attack. Now, this wasn't back in the Marcus Welby days where we said, here's an aspirin, we'll see how you're doing in 4 weeks. She had had stenting of her heart. When I got to her, she was on life support. She was on a breathing machine. She was on these drugs that make your heart beat harder and keep your blood pressure up so that you can survive and oxygenate the rest of your body. But she wasn't on one of those drugs. By the time I got to her, she was on 3 of them. And there was maybe one more we could add. So I did my assessment of her. I looked back to see what had gone on and what her medical history was before the 12 hours that she'd ended up in my hospital. And I thought through our next steps, and I steadied myself, and I went in to talk to her family. There really weren't many other people around because of the hour it was. I walked into the family room. And there were 3 women. 2 of them were about the same age as the patient, and one was about 25 years younger. And I walked in and I said, "Hi, are you here with so-and-so?" And I was accosted. They said, "Yes," and this woman ran up and she shoved a paper in my face and she said, "I'm her healthcare proxy." I said, "Awesome." It was not an experience I'd had before. And we sat and we talked for probably 20 minutes. And we talked about the patient, and they cried and they laughed and they just shared all the love that they had for her with me. And the time came and I said, "Did you ever talk to her about what she'd want in this situation?" And I told them that we were doing everything, but she wasn't responding. And that there were a few more things we could do, but I didn't think it was going to work. I think she's going to die. And they cried and they hugged each other and they said she would not want this. She did not want to be on life support. I said, "Okay." We made arrangements. They were able to be in the room with her. Her life support was stopped, and she died within an hour with them at her side. These women who loved her, they were her family, not by blood, but by her choice and their choice. They were her family. They knew what she wanted. They didn't want her to die. They didn't want to let her go. They were crazy about her, but they didn't want her to suffer, and she had told them no. So all they did in this last experience, this last moment, was acted out the love that they had for her by helping me, the physician, carry out the patient's last wishes. They didn't have guilt. They were sad, but they didn't have guilt. They weren't, are we making the right decision? Are we doing what the patient wanted? They knew. They'd had that conversation. And that profoundly changed me, watching this happen, because all they had to do was act out their love for her with what she told them she wanted. And that was amazing. Just amazing. So now I'm going to switch back into my story. So Evan had been diagnosed. He'd had 2 hard years where he wasn't ready to jump back into life. He'd had 3 good years, and now he's back on that downward spiral from the malignant transformation. We kept talking, and he kept telling me, if I can't be Evan, I don't want to be. What kind of help is that? We'd already crossed the bridge of the walking. We were just getting closer and closer and closer to it. I'd mentioned before he loved cooking. We had every adaptive kitchen gadget you could ever imagine. When I say he loved cooking, he was the cook for our house. I can heat things up and I bake really well, but that's about it. We had a salt and pepper mill that was just electric and the touch of your thumb, and out it comes. He figured out a way to grate cheese one-handed in our kitchen, because our kids ate a lot of cheese. It was really impressive. We had a bagel cutter. That's not all that impressive, that he could do with one hand, and 3 electric one-handed can openers by the time he died. I cleaned this out. This is a picture of him with, this is our first, at her first birthday. This is us having fun in Chatham. It looks like it's Christmas. This is a really funny picture to me, because you will notice I am wearing an apron. And I am in the kitchen, and I think it's Thanksgiving. So we did things. He couldn't cook, so he told me how to cook. That was awesome. And we continued to live our lives as he continued to worsen. The conversations with hospice involved and who wants to be where when he dies and knowing what he wanted continued. The same way you watch a baby or a child reach all those milestones, they sit, they stand, they babble. Evan lost all those things. His right arm, he was right-handed, his right arm was the first thing to go. I was amazed at what he could teach himself to do with that left hand. That right leg I described earlier, he had trouble with. And he'd fall on occasion. The dog tripped him one Christmas. We're sitting there waiting to open presents for at least 20 minutes before one of us goes outside to look for him. It was raining. It was lovely. He lost his taste. He could still use his left hand and make some food, but he couldn't taste things. Those were some exciting meals because you're faced with, do you eat it and smile, or do you say, ooh, unedible? Harder decision for a grown woman than a small child. They had no problem telling him it was awful. Finally, he lost his ability to talk. For somebody who used his brain as much as he did and really, really loved to talk, this was awful. Now, there's some funny stories that came out of it, like the first time we noticed he was having trouble, he and I had watched a movie, and we got up at the end of the movie, and I said, oh, did you let the dog out? And he goes, yes, no. And I'm like, well, which one? Yes, no. And that continued for probably 3 to 4 months, and he knew the answer, but he couldn't get it out. And we tried to figure out, was it the first word he said? Was it the last word he said? Was there any pattern to it? And we could never figure it out. As things were getting worse, he went out with the nanny who took as much care of him as she did of the children. And I don't know what he was doing, but he took my credit card. And for 3 or 4 days, he just had something to tell us. It was burning, and he just couldn't get it out because his speech was so difficult. 4 to 5 days after this started, my eldest sat down with him and figured out he'd lost my credit card. So I needed to call and cancel it. 5 days, that's ridiculous. Evan worked through February of 2017. He got rides to and from work every day. At the end, he had a wheelchair that pushed him. He had somebody who pushed him in a wheelchair to get him into the office. But I still think that kept him going for so much longer than if he hadn't done it. In the beginning of March, we had a party. As I mentioned before, Evan was Jewish, Evan was Jewish, and I am not. So our 14-year-old, at that stage of the game, wanted to have a bat mitzvah. So she did all her studies. We did everything. And this was the last time he left the house. The fire department, love them all, came, carried him out of the house into the car, and brought him back and put him into the house so he could attend this party. He died April 5th, 2017. He was at home. We were all at home. The oldest, Natalie, and I were able to be with him while he took his last breaths. There was a rabbi from Hospice who was very close to us, became very close to us, and she was able to come right away, and it was just an interesting and wonderful and horrible and awful experience, but he wasn't suffering. At that stage, I imagined him somewhere using all of his body, able to tell everybody everything that he had inside his head. I missed him horribly, as did my children, but our part of that journey, his part of that journey, was over. I had had the opportunity to grieve with Evan for many of the milestones that he had lost. My daughter informed me last night she did not do any of that ahead of time. But that helped me move along. I realize that my experience is very unique, as everybody's experience is. But Evan was a physician. I'm a physician. His sister that I showed you the picture of before is a palliative care doc in Ohio. So I had a lot of support and a lot of resources. I've mentioned how helpful the fire department was and how people in the community helped us. One of the things that came up in the end, really when hospice got involved, is I said to Evan, I said, I love you, but your Judaism is not my tradition. Everything that you want at your funeral, your Shiva, needs to be written down, or it's going to be an opportunity for people to fight. And I love you. If it's not written down, it's all happening at the Methodist Church. I feel completely comfortable with that. So we spent a fair amount of time planning it out. I had friends, neither of whom were Jewish, that did the Shiva for us, put the Shiva on. One of them was the friend with the paper plates. She found shiva.com and learned a whole lot. His experience, my experience with his death, is he had it how he wanted it to be. He was at home, he was with us, and I got to love him fully and completely to the end of his life. There are certainly some things I could have done much more gracefully, much more graciously, but I don't have any regrets with how it happened. And that leaves me feeling really good. If you have someone you love, talk with them. Let them know. Have the conversation frequently, depending on where they are in their stage of aging or health issues, because things change. I know it's hard to have these conversations. He didn't want to talk to me about it for 2 years. My parents were here last weekend. I said, hey, I'm giving this talk. Let's talk. I'm my dad's healthcare proxy. We had a nice talk. Nothing's changed. My mom yelled at me, and she told me I was being mean. So I tried, and I know it's not easy, but if there's somebody that you love, talk with them. And I know you're all here because this is important to you, but keep going because you can help people and make this a better experience for them. Thank you so much for listening to me. Oh.